Good Friday morning, Manna Gatherers. Here we are. It is May 14th. I had to think about it for a minute. What is today? May 14th, and we're heading on to the weekend. So one last time with you together in Lamentations 5:21. Not one last time with you, but one last time together as we read Lamentations 5:21. Today I am reading from the New Living Translation. Restore us, O Lord, and bring us back to you again. Give us back the joys we once had. So right now I am reading a book by a guy I went to seminary with, Tyler Sitt, who is a United Methodist minister in Minneapolis, St. Paul area of Minnesota. He wrote this book called Staying Awake, The Gospel for Change Makers. And I'm teaching through this book in June, the month of June here at Union during the Sunday school hour. So I am taking lots and lots of copious notes and agreeing with some of it and wrestling with other parts and not agreeing with all of it. That has been written by Tyler, but it's a conversation, a good conversation. And I know that when I go to teach and discuss it in June with the folks here at Union, there will certainly be a lot of thought-provoking conversations. One thing he wrote really stuck with me. A thought that actually the dean of Marsh Chapel at Boston University, where Tyler and I went to seminary, the Reverend Dr. Robert Allen Hill, he said to me while I was in seminary going through a very difficult, hard year, Dr. Hill said, and I'm paraphrasing because it's been a dozen years ago, he said, pay attention to your suffering and remember it, because you will use it one day to connect with people in your congregation. Tyler Sitt, in the book Staying Awake, reminded me of this conversation with Dr. Hill when he writes in his book, suffering is both terrible and illuminating. Don't waste it. Suffering is both terrible and illuminating. Don't waste it. Right before this line, Tyler talks about remembering. That much of the Old Testament is dedicated to remembering, especially remembering the bad that turned good, the despair. Suddenly, within the despair, there is suddenly found hope, that darkness is shattered by light. He writes, don't forget the battlefields you have survived. Remember. Pay attention to your suffering, because while the suffering is terrible, it can also be illuminating for you and for others. Why do we have a book called Lamentations? A book of lament, of sorrow, of grief, of sadness, of mourning. It seems like after generations of thousands of years of remembering such things, we would like to just remember the good and do away with the bad times. Why do we have this book? To remember that what we have been through as individuals and as people. To also remember that through it all, God was there restoring, renewing, refreshing, resetting, returning us the joy of the Lord even as we endure seasons of lament. The book, Lamentations, is the ultimate book, therefore, I think, of remembering our suffering. And the author of Lamentations, in just 5 chapters, tells the stories of terrible, terrible suffering. But the writer also uses the opportunity to call attention to not only the suffering, but to illuminate the steadfast presence of God, who does not abandon us or never has abandoned anyone in any of their suffering. Our God is a God of renewal, of restoration, of fresh starts. Remember how many times that you have experienced such renewal, such restoration, and new starts with God. Can you even count how many times you've been brought out of your suffering, through your suffering, only to have grown closer to God through it all, only to have become a better person through it all, only to have understood others better through all that you have gone through. Such experiences should be shared. As the writer of Lamentations shares both suffering and moments of illumination with us thousands of years later. I said on Wednesday that if you find yourself between a rock and a hard place right now, you will have good company with the author of Lamentations, who seems to be in a miserable time of his life. Because some human experiences, like suffering and restoration and even renewal and fresh starts, are timeless and universal. Such experiences continue to speak across generations and even within our own generation to one another. When I went to my first church, I was only 25 years old. I went straight from undergrad to seminary, and thus I did not have what I felt was a real life experience, because most of my experience of life up until that point had been academia. I was sent to a church where the average age, I would probably say, was like 70-ish. One of our so-called younger members, who was in their mid to late 40s, asked me, this was within the first week or so of being there, how will you ever be able to pastor a man who has been through a divorce? Or, for that matter, how will you ever pastor a woman who wants to get pregnant but hasn't been able to because you've never had that experience? Well, I was a little hurt and taken aback and caught off guard, all those things. I let it sit for a moment. I thought about it for a minute. He was right. I had never known those exact experiences of heartache, but I had a simple response to him. I said, well, I haven't had those exact experiences of heartache and sorrow and suffering, but I have known hurt, and I have known loss, and I have known suffering. So I think I can be a compassionate companion to someone going through those things. But here's my real answer. I bet there are people who have been through those exact kind of experiences, those times of difficulty. And I, as a pastor, would help connect those members to listen and share and care for one another, for those who have been through similar times. Well, it turns out that this man who approached me with these questions had been through both of these experiences. The first rather early in his life, and the second was an experience of the near past. So when he shared that with me, I simply said, well, praise God that praise God that God has brought you through both of these times of sorrow, because now you have the gift to be able to sit with someone and really empathize their sorrow and their suffering, and then share hope and share with them your journey back to joy. I share that with you as a connection to Lamentations point. Lamentations simply points out the unavoidable in life. Suffering, strife, sorrow, sadness, conflict, heartache, disappointment. It's all right there in Lamentations, and I think it's all there and shared and remembered over and over for all these thousands of years, because it's unavoidable. But Lamentations also, within its 5 chapters, points us back to joy, back to hope, back to renewal and wholeness. So don't waste your suffering. Remember, suffering can be both terrible and illuminating. I will see you next week for more Morning Manna.